Hi there, welcome everybody to the second AGI Young Investigator webinar series. As you know, the Ataxia Global Initiative is hosting this webinar series for young investigators in the ataxia field to introduce you to important aspects of various research topics. The second webinar series of the Ataxia Global Young Investigator Initiative is iScience and about hot topics in the respective fields and future research perspectives. Today, the AGI Working Group for Digital Motor Biomarkers will give the webinar Quantitative Gait and Balance Outcomes for Ataxia Trials.
Yeah, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, but just at first, something I have to announce. So I have constructional work in the background here, so there might be some noise, so excuses for that in advance. But coming back to our speakers today, Fay Horak is scientific advisor for the Balance Disorders Laboratory and the Jainat MD Endowed Professor of Neurology and Adjunct Professor of Behavioral Neuroscience and Biomedical Engineering at Tuebingen Health and Science University. She is also Chief Scientific Officer at the APDM Wearable Technology Company that maybe all of you are aware of. It provides precision movement technology for clinical trials. And she has a background as a physical therapist and neuroscientist who is known for her research on the neuropsychology of balance disorders and in particular their rehabilitation. So moreover, she received a degree in physical therapy from the University of Wisconsin and neurophysiology from the University of Minnesota and a PhD finally of neuroscience from the University of Washington in Seattle. She has received many national awards from the American Physical Therapy Association and is the first physical therapist to receive a prestigious merit award, so congratulations, of the National Institute of Health. So she has patented several new technologies for the measurement and rehabilitation of balance disorders and helped to start the small company APDM that develops synchronized wearable sensors to quantify exactly posture and gait. So Dr. Horak is the first elected president of the International Society of Posture and Gait Research and therefore an excellent speaker for the topic today. Winfried is maybe also known by everybody here in this virtual room. He is the head of the Clinical Motion Lab at the Hertie Institute for Clinical Brain Research at the University of Tuebingen here in Germany. His research is dedicated to the quantitative analysis of neurological movement disorders, in particular a focus on cerebellar, ataxic gait, and posture impairments. The research includes quantitative descriptions of ataxia-related and specific spatiotemporal gait characteristics that finally allow to identify preclinical, mainly subtle motor changes in those complex gait tasks, as well as to capture also treatment-induced improvements in physiotherapy or exergame studies. So accordingly, he is interested in the functional role of the cerebellum in motor control, motor learning, and rehabilitation in cerebellar ataxia patients. And current research topics include the use of machine learning methods for markerless video analysis, as well as multivariate classifications and quantifications of ataxia-specific motor changes in patients' real-life walking behavior using wearable sensors to establish somehow ecologically valid biomarkers for natural history and or interventional studies. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Many thanks for being here today. Just one or two last housekeeping notes and reminders. This webinar will be recorded. And if you have questions, you can already place them in the Q&A section while the talk is ongoing. We will answer them afterwards in a discussion part. So, and with this, enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Heike. Thank you, Ira. And Fay Horak and me want to welcome you to our webinar about gait and balance outcomes for ataxia trials. Fay Horak and me are coordinating this working package 1, balancing gait, within the digital motor working group at the AGI, and I think we are very productive in this working group. And the aim is, as the other working groups, also to standardize tasks, protocols, and measures that we can aim for outcomes for multi-center treatment assessments. We think, and all the patient reports have shown that balance and walking impairments are very important for ataxia patients, as you can see in this out diagram. The most important impairments for the patients are here shown in red and in big letters, and you can identify that balance, walking, not being able to move free is very important for the patient. So gait and balance could be an interesting and important biomarker for that. To be an good and important biomarker, this biomarker has to fulfill several requirements, and from these requirements we want to talk about today. As you can see here, we will talk about the sensitivity and specificity of ataxia measures, or of gait measures in ataxia, of correlations with these ARA, the sensitivity to longitudinal change, and also retest reliability and meaningfulness to patients. The last introduction slide is about the recording technology. In the consensus paper, we had a detailed comparison about recording technologies for multi-centered trials. As you see here, and there are several important factors like cost, feasibility without a dedicated laboratory, time required to prepare, limitations in the spatial measurement range, and so on. And given all this, the optical motion analysis will be the gold standard anyway. But we think that variable sensors technology is today the most promising technology for multi-centered trials. So the most of the coming methods and approaches will use this variable IMU sensor technology. So far for the introduction, I will now stop here and hand over to Fay Horak.
What I'm going to be talking about today is how wearable technology can provide digital balance and gait outcomes for clinical trials. It's very practical, feasible, and safe, and it's already being used in many clinical trials. And also to talk about what we're trying to measure in gait imbalance. My hypothesis, and I have some evidence for, is that the gait problems that people with cerebellar ataxia have are really balance problems, dynamic balance problems. And then when you test people's balance by having them stand still and try not to sway, you have to decide which condition to use. And so we've done some studies looking at different conditions, and you want to make sure it's a condition that most of the patients in your research study can perform. If it's too challenging that even a healthy person can't perform, it's not going to be very useful for measuring. And then I'm going to show you some slides. We need to decide whether we can use the same balance and gait measures for every kind of ataxia, Or do we have to have different measures for each different kind of ataxia? And there's many, many kinds of ataxia. So I'm hoping some of them will be consistent across the different types, the characteristics. And lastly, our digital balance and gait measure ataxia related to disease severity as a neurologist would evaluate it, and meaningful for patients as from their point of view. So as Winfried was saying, the traditional way of measuring balance and gait are these two. If you look on the left, it's motion capture. That is, you have digital cameras put in a laboratory, and you put markers on a person's joints, and then you can quantify all their joint kinematics as they walk. One of the problems with this is you can only look at a few steps at a time. And as you'll be seeing, is the major problem with gait in people with ataxia is that not that they can't move their joints, but that it's a coordination problem that leads to variability, increased variability of gait. And you can't measure gait variability from 3 or 4 gait cycles. What you need is many gait cycles. So we recommend, and I'll be talking about gait when people walk for 2 minutes. So for 2 minutes, you have enough gait cycles to get a stable standard deviation or standard error of the gait. One interesting study that was done in 2003 in Amy Bastian's lab, Susan Morton, is that they asked the foot placement problems of gait in people with ataxia. Is it due to primarily to the problem with placing their leg in a particular position, like they have trouble pointing to their nose with their finger? Is that the problem? Or is it a problem with balance? And so what they did is they looked at people walking, and then they stabilized them by having them hold on to a handle, and then they asked them to place their feet. And then what they found is that the balance deficits are more related to the cerebellar gait ataxia than the leg placement deficits. So it's more a problem of controlling the body center of mass at the trunk, and then to compensate for excessive trunk motion, they move their feet wider, more variable in width and length, and they spend less time, more variable time, and 2 feet versus 1 feet. And all that gait variability is probably just trying to keep themselves from falling down. And what's also known for even more years from the late 1980s and early 1990s is that if you ask a person with cerebellar ataxia to stand still, you can quantify their imbalance by looking at postural sway. And the traditional way of doing that is with a force plate, where the displacement of the center of pressure under the feet is measured. And you can see in the top graphs on the right, the larger sway with eyes closed and eyes open. And this sway measure can be quantified with many, many measures, over 50 measures of sway, not only sway area, but velocity and jerkiness and peak to peak and on and on. And so we always, for gait and for sway, we need to decide which of the many, many possible digital measures we can capture are best for a clinical trial in people with cerebellar ataxia. So as was mentioned, I not only work at OHSU part-time, but I'm also work part-time at a company called Clario. APDM was a startup company. We started in 2007 to make these inertial sensors. And 3 years ago, it was bought by a big company that provides technology to 75% of all the clinical trials in the world. And they decided to add movement. So they added the Opals and mobility lab system. So I'm just a part-time employee there now. But one thing I do is help advise pharmaceutical companies what outcomes and what protocols they might want to use for a clinical trial. So here's an example with sway. I'll talk about standing balance first. I'm going to show you a video of a person standing and trying to keep their balance on an incline with their eyes closed. But this person has bilateral vestibular loss and no cerebellar problem, and he falls over like a tree as an inverted pendulum. Here's a person with cerebellar ataxia trying to do the same thing. And you can see the excessive hip and trunk motion when she's trying to keep her balance. So that excessive forward and backward motion is characteristic of spinocerebellar ataxia. And here's the stabilograms that we can quantify, not with a force plate now, but with an inertial sensor on the low back, which is close to the body center mass. You can use the acceleration signals. Forward and backward is up and down, anterior, posterior, and medial lateral is left and right. Here's a healthy control, a person where the SARA score is so low, a neurologist is not sure they have ataxia, and yet their sway is larger than normal. And then a person whose SARA score is 12, which means, they have more ataxia, and you can see much bigger sway. So this has been known since Dr. Tuebingen's and Diener studies on cerebellar ataxia in Tuebingen in the 1980s and early 90s. We did a study with 186 people with spinal cerebellar ataxia, 50 people with Friedreich's ataxia, and 50 controls matched for the older SCA patients and 50 for the younger FA patients. And we wanted to ask of the different conditions that are often performed in a clinical exam of standing balance, which would be the best one for wearable sensors? That is, which ones can most of the patients actually perform? And so what you see on the left are for spinal cerebellar ataxias 1, 2, 3, and 6. You can see the number of subjects we had in each group. And on the right for the healthy control subjects, and below for the people with Friedreich's ataxia. And it's the percent of the subjects that could actually do the test for standing for 30 seconds. So eyes open, eyes closed, 100% of the SCA1 patients could do that, 100% of the SCA3 patients, 100% of the SCA6. The SCA2 is more difficult. As soon as they close their eyes, they are now 92%. So only 8 out of 100 would be missed. And you can see that the harder the test gets, like now in the third condition, the feet are together, eyes open, and then the feet are together, eyes closed. The the fewer and fewer patients can do the test. They can reach 30 seconds. And in tandem, very few people can do the test, especially with SCA1 and SCA2. So if you were going to pick a condition that most of the patients can do, you'd want to pick one of the first 3 conditions where at least 80% of the people could do the test. And when you look at Friedreich's ataxia, you can see the hardest condition, tandem stance, eyes closed, even the young adults without any cerebellar damage, only 20% could do that for 30 seconds. So that's not a very useful test. But they also have more trouble with eyes closed, even when their feet are apart. We use a template when feet are apart, so everybody stands at the same distance. But unlike the SCA patients, eyes closed is very difficult for them. They have, it's easier for them to stand with feet together, eyes open, almost 80%. So one of the characteristics we want to show, if you want to have a good marker as an outcome for clinical trials, is ICCs or test-retest reliability. And the higher, closer to 1, the better that is. And so if you look on the first column for the SCA patients, the test-retest reliability is not as good for the eyes open natural stance condition as it is for the little more difficult condition, natural stance, eyes closed, where you get a 0.81 or feet together, eyes open. And the other thing you want to look for is area under the curve. That is, how sensitive and specific is your measure? And with the natural stance, eyes open, 73% of the patients could be identified as SCA versus controls, and it was accurately classified. Whereas if you get to natural stance, eyes closed, now 86% of the people could be accurately classified. So pretty good and statistically significant. For the Friedreich's ataxia patients, we find similar very good reliability. And again, it's a little better in the natural stance, eyes closed, and an excellent area under the curve. You can separate patients. In fact, you can almost separate every person with Friedreich's ataxia from control, even in the easiest condition, 95, 96%. And that's for sway area. We always look out of the 50 measures of sway, what is the measure that has the best sensitivity and specificity? And we find that jerkiness of sway, it was the best, but sway path length, the range of sway, like the peak-to-peak range, sway area, they're all very good. And root mean square sway, they're all very good. Both eyes open and eyes closed, all these measures come out at the top. But many of the patients could not stand with eyes closed. So we, That would be one reason why you'd want to, even though the same measures for those who could stand, we're very sensitive to them. We had 186 patients with eyes open, and we ended up at 89 eyes closed. Now, the other thing you'd want to know for outcome for a clinical trial is whether your outcome is good for, it's sensitive to each kind of SCA that you want to test. And so here you see the distribution for the different sway measures for control subjects, SCA 1, 2, 3, and 6. And you can see SCA 2 patients seem to have more sway than the other conditions, but all of the conditions, all the different kinds of SCAs were significantly different from controls, whether you're looking at path length, area, range, or root mean square. They're all statistically significantly different from healthy people the same age. That means we could use the same measure for across these 4 kinds of SCA. And the other thing you'd like to know is whether when the sway gets bigger, does that mean, is that related to when the neurologist thinks this ataxia is worse? And so we used the SARA score for that. And you can see for the 4 different kinds of SCAs, and this is for natural stance eyes open, a significant correlation with the SARA score for all these kinds. Now with eyes closed, it was not as strong as with eyes open, especially for SCA 6. Now, when we switch from sway to gait, again, now we're looking at dynamic balance during walking. And the 4 top measures that we find differentiate ataxia gait from normal gait are these. One is called toe out angle standard deviation. And what that is really a measure of the variability of lateral foot placement. The farther your foot is apart, the more your toes are pointing out in external rotation. And the worse your balance, the more likely you want a wider stride width and more variable stride width as you're trying to catch your balance from left to right. And you can see that that's significantly abnormal, that variability measure in all the SCAs. Double support variability, the time you spend with both feet on the ground is variable, and we call that a dynamic measure, dynamic balance measure, and it's abnormal in all the groups. The toe off angle, which is how you push your foot, that's also very variable in these 4 kinds of SCAs, and as well as elevation of the foot at mid-swing, how high the foot is off the ground. And neurologists will also often say that there's a hypermetric gait or high stepping, and it's not only that, but it's also variable. And we find some of the same kinds of measures abnormal in Friedreich's ataxia. For example, here's elevation of the foot at mid-swing is very abnormal. In fact, almost every single subject showed more variability of that measure in our Friedreich's group compared to the age-matched controls. Now, both the SCA and the Friedreich's gait measures that we've been talking about are reliable and sensitive. Reliability is this ICC, and you could see it's close to 1. It's very, very high for all the measures. And the area under the curve is very good. That means we can differentiate controls from ataxic gait by almost 90% or more. The one difference between the Friedreich's patients, though, and the SCA patients is that the trunk range of motion variability is very high in the Friedreich's patients. Higher, we didn't see it come out near the top for the SCA patients. What we saw for them was the toe-off angle variability, but that wasn't true for the Friedreich's patients. So the other measures, the elevation of the foot in mid-swing, the toe-out angle or the stride width variability, and the double support variability, those were very similarly very sensitive in both groups. So if you wanted to measure, if you had a drug that you wanted to use that included Friedreich's as well as SCA, you might want to choose one of the bottom 4 measures. And for SCA, these gait measures are related to the SARA scores, just like the sway measures related to the SARA scores. And it also related to disease duration. We published this in Movement Disorders a couple of years ago. And that tells you that these measures make sense from a neurological point of view, that they reflect the disease. Also, you want to make sure your measures relate to what patients care about. And so, for example, we have here the mFARS ADL score, how the patients rate their own function in daily life. And you could see that the double support variability, elevation, mid-swing variability, toe-out variability, all were well related to what the patient said. When the ADL scores were worse, then there was more gait variability. They also had relationship with the SARA score for their trunk variability. So in summary, this is my mother-in-law, Betty, by the way. I'm always using people in my family as subjects in our studies. She's wearing the sensors on her feet, where we get a lot of those gait variability measures, and on her low back, where we're getting the sway and the turning measures, and the upper trunk is also sensitive to sway. But anyway, we find that wearable technology is already feasible and practical for multi-site clinical trials to quantify gait ataxia, both for standing balance and gait. And standing balance and walking balance control deficits characterize both SCA and Friedreich's. The standing balance conditions, for SCA, most of the patients could do it eyes open and eyes closed, feet apart, but the Friedreich's had trouble with eyes closed. Right? Most of them could do it when their feet were together, eyes open. So they're more dependent on vision. SCA gait is characterized by variability of foot placement, and Friedreich's, there's variability of trunk rotation as well as variability of foot placement. And these measures that we find are sensitive and specific to GL outcomes that characterize ataxia are also luckily reliable. If you test a person twice, same day, same week, same month, and they haven't changed, you're going to get the same numbers. And they're correlated with disease severity and with their ADL scores, which means they're meaningful to patients. Okay, that's the end. Before we can, whoops, I can stop sharing. So Winfried can talk about his studies.
I want to add some other important aspects. One of them is the sensitivity to longitudinal change. You all know that upcoming clinical trials will aim to prove the therapy-induced slowing of progression within a relatively short time frame, 1 or 2 years. And if we look at the longitudinal data, then we have to recognize that there are very few longitudinal studies out there in the field of degenerative cerebellar ataxia, very heterogeneous in terms of population, motion capture, duration, and measures. Friedreich ataxia, as Fay also already mentioned, seems to be a little bit different from the sensitive measures. This is probably induced by the early onset and the adolescence of a very fast progression to walking aid and gait speed as an effective measure. So probably we have to distinguish at that point for the degenerative cerebellar ataxia and Friedreich ataxia. Why is this longitudinal sensitivity really important? And I want to show you that one of these slides, one of these diagrams Fay showed you for a second, there is a high correlation with this SARA score. But if we look at it, how then you can get the impression that this correlation is predominantly driven by the end of this spectrum here at this SARA score, and then there's not so much sensitivity in these ranges. So we have to look, is there longitudinal sensitivity also in these ranges? And really, can we capture longitudinal changes in short trial-like time frames with a high effect size we really need? And this is a very current study, multicentric, together with Paris, the group of Alexandra Thur. We have captured SCA2 patients also with the ABDM census. This is an early stage population, including 8 pre-ataxic subjects. And in this, if you look at the right, you cannot, after 1 year, that there's no progression in this STARA score, but there's progression in one of our variability measures called lateral deviation. I will explain this in a second. And if we look here, and then if you identify longitudinal change, then you can do sample size estimation for future intervention trials to estimate how many patients you will need to detect an assumed 50% reduction of the 1 year progression. And as you see here, the lateral step deviation would need 43 patients if we include only ataxia patients and exclude the ataxic subjects, then we would need 37. As we have no increase in the STARA score, I have to compare this here with other studies and with an increase of severity populations. But you can see here, if you use these STARA score in these other studies, then you are much higher. So this is a very promising result for our gait measure. Fay Horak has already mentioned the test-retest reliability is important, and also the minimal detectable change. And this minimal detectable change is then calculated based on the test-retest reliability, and this is actually important in determining whether a treatment-related slowing of disease progression can be reliably detected, or is it lost in the measurement noise. That means your longitudinal change to detect in the trial has to be larger than the MDC. Because if it's smaller, then you will end up in measurement noise. So we have to look, is our motion capture method and our gait measures they have a test-retest reliability adequate and an appropriate minimal detectable change. And in this Paris Tuebingen data, you see that our measured lateral step deviation can distinguish between healthy controls and patients, correlate highly to this STARA score, and thus good test-retest reliability. And we have an significant with high effect size and longitudinal change after 1 year, which is larger than the MDC, and I think this is very promising. This is a short description what we mean with lateral step deviation. This is the absolute perpendicular deviation of the midfoot position. That means if you have this left foot and take one step and another step with the left foot, and here he draw a line. And this is the deviation, the natural deviation. That means this measure is a kind also of spatial variability measure, and we have shown that this correlated how highly with the ABC score, capturing these subjective balance confidence. So it seems also to be meaningful to patients. What is also the prospective advantage in the for the variable lenses, that we can not only capture patients in the laboratory, but also in the real life. I will this is more future work. I will very briefly mention this, but the benefits could be more data. We measure the behavior, not the ability. It's more ecological valid. It could be more sensitive, but you see on the right side there are some challenges. You need the compliance with the patients. It's less controllable, and there's higher variability. And we have to do, for instance, also we have to know what are the context dependence influence on our gait measures. One problem, as you can see here, how can we compare longitudinal real life assessments? You can imagine if at the baseline the patient is only walking indoor, and after 1 year then he is walking outdoor, then it's very hard to compare these two time points. So we have to select comparable walking paths. We have to make sure, if we want to compare 2 time points, that the context and the walking paths are comparable. And this is much more complex in real life than in the lab, obviously. And we have done first work to estimate the context, and we had walking paths about the path length and also about the amount of turns. And if we do this, then we can really compare these different time points, and we have done this with several state measures. And the first results were really that we can see in real life also this is a heterogeneous cerebellar ataxia population, and also included some later onset patients. But here we can show that we can see real life changes even after 1 year, and changes in the SARA score and in the app, not after 1 year, but after 2 years. Also, this is very promising. But as I said, I think this is more complex, and the first outcome measures will be most probably not in real life, but in the app assessments. We did with our lateral step deviation. We did recently also one single case treatment trial with the newly identified SCA 27E, and we were able to show in the lab and also in real life that we can really identify changes which are also meaningful to the patients measured at in the PGI. Also, there's no change in this HARA. So, coming to this summary, I think we have identified many measures who are sensitivity, who show sensitivity for ataxia in terms of identifying healthy controls from patients, and also showing correlations with this HARA score, with the ABC score, or with other functional scores. There's only a few longitudinal studies, a few individual studies, and coming to my next slide, we will need some common databases and some common studies. One big problem also, this going to the next slide, is to show that our gait measures are really meaningful for the patients, and more complex and the big topic in the future will be the monitoring of walking behavior in real life. So these are the biggest problems from my side. The next important steps, we have to show that changes in gait are meaningful to patients. One possibility which is has been published recently from the also from the FDA is then to associate these measures with the AGI. I think very important is, as I said, to combine this individual studies. You have probably identified that the Fay Horak has behind you other gait measures than me, so we have to establish really common longitudinal gait databases to harmonize these results. And the first step as an AGI, we have we want to establish a common protocol in the AGI consensus paper, which is unfortunately still under review. In this protocol, we proposed all the tasks and all the assets we would need to harmonize really the gait and balance capturing in the ataxia patients. So this is all I want to present you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very instructive talk and very practical, since we learned which might already be the most promising concrete features of gait. We have already some questions in the Q&A, and I think we'll start with them. And I invite everybody to add even more if you have more than those that have already been posted. I think the first question is going, Fay, to you. You can also open it if you would like to have yourself a look at it. So the question was, do you think that a widening of gait actually improves stability? And whether I really like that, for example, is it an efficient compensation mechanism? Is that the mechanism behind how you would explain what you see in your observations? Is it kind of a compensation?
I think it is. If the problem is inability to keep the trunk stable to gravity, and so that you're moving your trunk, let's say, too far, and most of balance control in gait comes most of the control your brain has to use to control your balancing gait is the left and right direction, the medial lateral direction. So if that's too large, then an efficient strategy is to widen your base so your center mass stays with 2 feet, right? But as you keep on moving, then you have to vary that. So if your center mass moves farther, then you have to move your foot out even farther. And that, I think, is where the variability comes in. I think it's
with a natural limit at some point, right?
There is, exactly. There's a natural limit. You bounce off the wall or you fall, right? I think it's interesting. I study also people with Parkinson's disease, and they have terrible balance. They fall all the time, and yet they hold their feet very close together. They never widen their base, right? But they don't have wide sway. They have very small sway. They're very stiff. And so they don't need to compensate for their trunk moving all over the place. So I think it is a effective strategy. I don't think they'd be able to walk if you had such a large postural sway of your trunk and you kept your feet just walking normally. So I think it's a good thing, but it also characterizes their balance problem. And so maybe we're measuring their compensation. That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think the next question is from Matisunovtsik, SCA and Friedreich ataxia, eyes open and eyes closed tasks. It's again for you, Fay, I think. So when using the first 3 conditions, you will get ceiling effects. So are you sure that these are the most promising conditions?
If you mean by ceiling effects that there will be some patients that are in the normal range, I'm not sure that that's a big problem. It's true that not every single patient we measure, like in our study, we also had pre-ataxic people in the study that SERA scores were very low, like 1 or 2 or 0, but they had the gene. So I'm not too worried about some patients that are in the normal range, because we see that as they progress, they go outside the normal range. I don't think, it's not like a clinical test where you have to identify which conditions can a patient do in order to determine if they have a balance problem. And the more challenging the condition, the better the patient, right? So instead of doing that, we want a condition that most of the patients can do, but still it's we can measure how they try to control their balance in those conditions. So I don't think there's a big ceiling effect, actually.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think, sorry, I think the next question you answered already. I think it was placed before your final slides, that you said that the question was, which are the measures that show the biggest differences or can differentiate best between scars and FA? And I think you answered it already, but maybe you can briefly repeat.
Sure. I think it's interesting. I looked over the videos of the FA because I wanted to understand why was it lateral trunk variability that was so abnormal in them? And I think I see 3 reasons for that. One is they navigate, they veer from left to right down the hallway. So they're going from the left wall to the right wall. So that could contribute to it. They also have trouble controlling the lateral motion of their trunk. And also they swing their arms really excessively. So you get a lot of rotation and translation of the trunk just from excessive arm swing. So from the videos, maybe that's why, but the SCA patients don't seem to show that excessive trunk sway. Maybe they're compensating better with their foot lateral variability. And they have more trouble though with variability of push off, and that you don't see in the FA patients. So the angle of their foot when they're pushing to move their center mass forward.
Okay, thank you. Winfried? Oh, okay.
Fine.
Next question is again dedicated to be answered by Fay, but of course you are both invited to answer it. It's going a little bit in the direction which readouts and statistics are then finally used to. The question is, why would one use standard deviation versus COV as a measure of gait variability, where the means are already very different between controls and patients with ataxia?
Well, we get pretty much the same answer, the same area under the curve for the RLC curves, whether we use coefficient of variation or standard deviation. I think it's interesting that the top 20 or so measures out of 100 are variability measures for gait, and whether you use standard deviation or coefficient of variation. So I think, yeah, we could talk to statisticians and argue about this, whether it should be coefficient of variation dividing by the mean. or standard deviation. Maybe we want to reflect both the mean difference and the variability difference and use standard deviation. I don't know. What do you think?
But on this point, I think it's important the mean show the difference between the patients and health controls. That's right, but this is mostly dependent on the patient population, right? If you have patients in an early state, then there's no difference in the mean. And all our work showed that the variability is, in particular in the early stage, more sensitive as the mean. And I do think also, if we look in longitudinal changes, the variability measures will also be substantially more sensitive as means.
Thank you. I think the next is a more clinical question. How does the presence of spasticity or Parkinsonism, sometimes associated with SCA, influence the results?
Perhaps I can say something to spastic hypotonia, because we, together with artists Sinana Nortzig and Rebecca Spüle, we look at as spastic ataxia, for example, SPG7, and obviously there is an influence, but the results show that our gait measures are quite effective also in determining the ataxia in this spastic ataxia patients when you have those influences. For Parkinson, maybe Fay has more experience.
I haven't looked at, I've looked at a lot of people with Parkinson's disease and a lot of people with spinal cerebellar ataxia, but not that many with both. I think a patient has to be their own control in a drug trial, for one thing. And if you improve either one, Parkinsonianism or ataxia, you'll see improvements of their gait. But I'm not positive if the same measures of gait would be the best ones for people with pure SCAs versus those have more mixed. And that's why when we started with SCAs 1, 2, 3, and 6, which are more similar to one another than some others. But I think that's an important question. We have to ask ourselves if the future clinical trials are going to include a wide variety of people with other neurological problems. I know this is something the regulators want to know. What if you have neuropathy? What if you have spasticity? Can we include them in the trial? Yeah.
When you have a look on the SCAs, Heike and Jennifer, the patients showing the most Parkinsonism is SCA2, right?
Yeah, and those patients they had the worst gait, but they had the same measures as normal.
Yeah. I think it's very hard to distinguish from an SCA two patients which of these way is influenced by the ataxia or by any influence of the Parkinson influence. I think this is very
But Parkinson's gait is normally they don't have good heel strike, they don't have good arm swing, they have less trunk motion than normal. So it's not the things you see with ataxia, right? And not the things we saw in SCA2. I
completely agree. I think the point is, what we can agree on is they will definitely have an influence on those measures, and maybe do aggravate gait disturbances, but not necessarily aggravate the particular chosen target readouts for that disease. But I think the most important point, Fay, you made with saying each subject has an intra-individual trajectory, and the changes of those intra-individual readouts at different time points is then important. So being its own control was, I would say, the most important point in that. Okay, so maybe just for the sake of time, we go to the next question that I think is going to Winfried. So regarding the lateral step deviation, you said using a line between the first and last third step, this is the baseline, and you calculate the deviation from it. So what if the first stride was already one out of line, do you look at the sequence, choosing those that are not out of line, or how do you deal with it?
We from the walking trajectories, we remove all the turnings, and then we really use all strides. Then we look at all three strides and then average over the whole walking bout. But it's very hard then to remove
Outliers.
single outliers.
So you're taking every triple possible and then average across it. Okay, I think this answers the question.
So the next one is, you said that gait and balance are disease-specific, STA or Friedreich, but would it be also STA type-specific, and so would lead to different types of parameters to analyze in a STA3 patient versus an STA2 patient?
So that's why we did the breakdown of the results, showing results from SA 1, 2, 3, and 6. And we found similar abnormalities, similar measures were abnormal in all those 4 types. I can't say that for every 50 types of SCA we'll find the same measures, but in those 4 types, we can definitely use the same measures, like lateral step deviation or external rotation of the foot variation for all those 4 types. And that could be true for postural sway as well. They're not that different.
Which is a good information with regard to regulatory agencies and thinking of trials. Okay, then the next question is, could the jerk measured in the eyes open condition be a good measure of kind of the cerebellar reserve?
I guess I don't know what reserve means. I think it's a sign of cerebellar disorder. I mean, the cerebellum's involved in integrating vision, vestibular, proprioception for posture control. And it receives feedback from all these systems, and they sway faster than normal. And so we record jerkiness is a differentiation of the accelerometer signal. So we're looking at a change in acceleration is faster in the cerebellar patients. So it's like they overcorrect, like when they try to touch their nose, they overcorrect. I think they do the same thing with their center mass. They recognize that they're unstable, they try to correct, but it's a hypermetric response, and then they have a jerky sway.
Okay, so I think a good last question to put everything in context is, where do you see these outcome measures currently? For example, biomarkers versus main primary outcome measures in ataxia. What efforts can advance them further?
Maybe I begin. As we have shown you, we think that this gait measures could be more sensitive, or has shown to be more sensitive than the ataxia clinical rates than SARA. There's nothing really out there in comparison with NFL or with MRT biomarkers. Probably MRT is a little bit in the early stage, earlier responsive. on the other hand, the gait markers would have the advantage of meaningfulness. So in summary, I think it's a very promising marker to be sensitive and meaningful.
And also these measures of balance and gait are already used for neurological patients in clinical trials as exploratory or secondary outcomes. In order to get into as a primary outcome for a clinical trial, they're going to have to be used in more as secondary outcomes to show that they're sensitive to change in large clinical trials. And that'll be in a phase 1 or phase 2 study, not a phase 3. But once they're shown to be more sensitive in these clinical trials, then they can eventually be used as a primary outcome. And the FDA all these electronic clinical outcomes assessments or performance outcomes, whereas the EMA would call them biomarkers. Mm-hmm. So the wording is different in different agencies and scientific cultures, but they can be used as performance outcome, like a stopwatch measure of gait speed would be already in clinical trials, just not as primary yet.
No, but I think we are really moving towards that, and I think this was the best closing remark we could get. And I think the advantages that you outlined are so obvious. They are very sensitive. They are improving sensitivity enormously in comparison to those very distinct clinical scales. So up to a continuum, if you're talking of variation or something like that, and it might be very easy to convince authorities of the meaningfulness of those measures. And I think this consensus paper might be a good next step. And I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm really curious whether you also found a consensus which device might be the best one. So I'm really curious and looking forward to that. And I think it will pave the way towards the acknowledgement of such parameters, really first as secondary, but then I would envision them in early trials as primary outcome measures. And even though I am, of course, a fan of imaging, I think the imaging role will be more like a stratification point rather than a progression point in those diseases. But let's see. I think the audience and the lots of questions underlined how important and how interesting this and impactful this topic is. So thank you very much, and thank you for your attention, and Ira again for organizing all the webinars. So bye then, and see you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.